Welcome to the second broadcast of Midrash Rabba 2.0, Vayeshev. And we are learning about the life of Joseph and all of the many facets of the English mistranslation. I'm Rabbi Q. This is Deborah. And we are going to jump into something very interesting. So in the first broadcast, we discussed the difference between the name Jacob being used in Torah and the name Israel being used in Torah as being a mystical reference to how to cause an ego death versus how to enhance the higher self. And furthermore, we discussed the value of a wife versus a concubine in the eyes of Torah. And we stumbled upon some Hebrew words that indicate the word wife in the English, but don't necessarily indicate the word wife in the Hebrew. And I during the break was thinking about, well, I will share something with you guys that I know is true, and that is a factual part of the whole process, and that is that Torah does not make any mistakes. Torah is not ambiguous. Torah does not leave you wondering how to interpret something. It gives you an opportunity to interpret something. In other words, it doesn't do weird, quirky stuff so that you have to try to become an initiate of something in order to understand it. It should be plain language. Now, we'll share with you that's not English, but it should be plain language. And what I mean by that is, if you read it in the Hebrew, one of the many facets of interpreting is the literal, right? Okay, but here's the issue. The word wife that is translated in the Hebrew for therefore shall a man leave his mother and father and be joined to his wife has a very interesting way of that being expressed. So I want to get into that a little bit. And the reason I do is because I think that it will become important not only to kind of put a cap on what we looked at before, where he goes with the sons of the concubines, and they're called concubines in a different area, very specifically in the reference where Reuben goes into Bilhah, who's Rachel's servant, and very specifically, I think it says milkmaid, I think is actually who Bilhah originally was, that Laban gave Rachel her milkmaid and gave Leah her milkmaid. So what's a milkmaid? That's a question we probably need to ask. But in the process, we have another thing going on here, and that is, I went ahead and I said, well, in Genesis chapter 2, verse 24, it says, therefore shall a man leave his mother and father, be joined to his wife. But then in another verse in Leviticus, it says that if a man goes into a woman and spills his seed, that he would be unclean till evening. And I argue that can't be true. One or the other has to be true. They can't both be true. However, something very interesting arose from this, and that is that maybe the verse in Leviticus is not referencing a wife. Okay, so I'm going to share with you what I think I'm understanding about this, because the mistake that I think we make is we try to apply modern understanding to ancient Hebrew culture, which, unless you have taken the time to learn and understand, you will miss certain things. And I'm not saying that I am necessarily an expert. I would love to be the expert in this, because I do believe that I have definitely experienced some special interpretation. But I want to go to Genesis chapter 1, Genesis chapter 2. I apologize. Verse 24, really quick here. Okay. And of course, it says, for this reason shall a man leave his mother and his father. Okay. And what I want you to see is where it says father, right? That this vav is being used as a pronominal suffix. But it's interesting. It's a possessive. So this is the father of him, is how this should read. If you read Zodiades, Spiro Zodiades' version of the Hebrew, he will interpret this particular pronominal suffix as of him instead of his. And I'm going to explain that in a minute. Okay, the next thing is, of course, his mother, still using this vav, pronominal suffix, third person. But the pronominal suffix is possessive, not personal. And what do I mean by that? Well, I'll tell you what. We'll just look at the screen right here. There is a difference between his and him. Okay. So a pronominal suffix that offers a pronoun that is third person masculine singular would be him, right? Or he, depending on whether it's active or passive. But then we also have the pronominal suffix offering a possessive, or what the Greek would call the genitive, which is basically that it is of his possession, is how we would think about it in the English. But that's not really how we think about it in the Hebrew. And I'm about to show you something that's actually going to be pretty amazing. So, okay, let's get back to this now. Moving over here to this part, ishto, right? Ishto, right? Beishto, in woman of him, okay? In woman of him. So this is davak, to be joined, right? So this is how it reads. Upon this, or upon yes, in other words, upon an affirmative particle, shall depart from, or go out from, shall leave, okay? A man, his definite direct object marker father, definite direct object marker mother, and he shall be joined to his wife, and they shall become third person masculine singular, they, those ones, I'm sorry, third person common singular, I'm sorry, plural, they shall be one, they will be flesh of one. And I believe this is in the construct state. Let's see if it is. No, it's in the absolute state. So it's not of one. So they shall be flesh one. Okay. So that's how it reads in the Hebrew. But what I want to point out, and this is an important thing that I was kind of meditating on during lunch, and I was thinking to myself, it's interesting, but we really don't necessarily have a word for wife in the Hebrew. We have a word for bride in the Hebrew, but we don't have a word for wife. So then I thought, well, this is dangerous, because there are opponents of Torah, opponents of the Bible, who claim that Torah is misogynistic. And one of the reasons they do is because of the Talmudic, the Talmudic rulings that kind of put women in a lower class, as if there was a class system. Okay. And so, and one of the verses that they cite is the verse where it says that a man shall treat his woman as he does his property, right? So I was thinking about this and I was going, it's interesting because what this really actually says in the Hebrew is his as in possessive pronoun wife. And I thought, I wonder if I'm off here. I wonder, and I could tell you, I don't want to be a part of a religion that treats women in a misogynistic manner. I want you to understand, I treat Deborah as a companion and as a soulmate in an equal manner to the best of my ability. In fact, truth be told, is a lot of times I come under her voice that is like what's the word I'm thinking of? It's like an influence that doesn't come out of her mouth. You guys ever get the look, right? That's a voice. So anyways, point being is a lot of times I try to defer to her, right? But in terms of soulmate and all that, that doesn't have anything to do with this verse where it's saying his wife, right? But it shouldn't be interpreted as wife, because truth be told, is this word isha just means woman, right? Okay, so there's a number of different ways we could look at this, but the best way to look at this would be to go back to the first time that the word isha is used. So let's do that really quick here. So we'll just go to that word right there, be'ishto, and it's actually isha in the Hebrew. And we go back to first usage, and it is actually 22:2, or 2:22, which is, and the Lord God fashioned into a woman the rib which he had taken from man and brought her to the man. And in the Hebrew, this is the first usage. It is not his. It is not his. Now we can get into the lamed and realize that in the Hebrew, you guys, it does not mean two. The lamed never means two. It means for the sake of. Okay? So you got to be cautious, because the English will translate a lamed as two. And in this case, into, which is very inappropriate, right? But the premise is he becomes for the sake of, or she becomes for the sake of, right? For the sake of woman. Okay. Now, we've already established in times past that the word woman itself has this hey, right, at the end here, whereas the word man does not. We can take a look at that in a minute, but I want you to see this hey. Okay. Whereas the word man has a yod and not a hey. It has the yod in the middle here. Okay. That yod right there. And notice both of them have the olive sheen, which we could get into sometime, but let's not. Just consider the fact that there's a hey at the end of this word. Okay. But this little dot underneath this olive is actually what we call an assimilated yod. There's actually a yod in there. Okay. But it's not spelled that way because the hey takes its place. And so it's isha versus ish. This is ish, right?
Strong's 376. Ish. Ish.
Okay. And so isha.
Strong's H802. Isha. Isha.
Okay. And so The reason why this is important is because an Isha is the word for wife. Yet right here, it's being translated as woman. So the Lord God fashioned into a woman. First of all, there's something you need to know. There is no such thing as a singular identifier particle in Hebrew. What do I mean by that? Come on, work, please. What do I mean by that? I mean that right here. That does not exist in Hebrew. We do not say a in Hebrew at all. We either say the or we don't say. And we don't say means that it is not a direct, or I mean, it's not definite. It's not the ball, it's a ball. Okay. So a woman, right? I'm sorry, a woman right here for the sake of a woman. So basically it says that he formed, right, out of the rib or from the rib of Adam. But here's the thing, this right here doesn't say wife. But what I want to show you is that if we go into the word in verse 24, it does say wife, but it's still Isha in a construct state, meaning of. So this isht right here, just this part right here would be pronounced isht, and then o, ishto, and then the be is in. So this is in his wife, is how this would read. But here's the part that's amazing about this. And this is when this hit me, I was like, oh, this is a rabbi's nugget, but I'm going to give it to him in the middle instead of at the end. Here it goes. Let's see, what do we need? I need that right there. Okay. And specifically, I need, let's see, library. I need, where did it go? This must be down here at the bottom. There it is. I need that right there. Okay. So we're going to go back to the beginning of this book. This is the Ancient Hebrew Language and Alphabet book, okay, which is another great book by Benner, because it shows us how these letters play a role in the story, right? And what we're going to go to is the Vav. And we're going to see something amazing here, okay? So first of all, the way I want you to think about this is that ropes are attached to pegs driven into the ground, support the tent, and the pegs were made of a branched piece of hardwood, preventing the ropes from slipping off the peg. Okay, let's admit one single truth here. Okay, the ancient Hebrews were not working with steel. They're working with stone. And the ancient Hebrews did not move into the Iron Age until around the time of Samuel. Before that, it was the Bronze Age. Before that, we have what we would call the Stone Age. Now, there's a couple of reasons why this is important. Stone Age, we're still going to be working with bushcraft, okay? So we don't start getting into metal stakes until about the late Bronze Age. Otherwise, we were using bone, we were using wood to fasten tents to the ground. Now, there's a few things that we probably need to take into consideration here, and that is that it's not a small little peg, okay? Tent stakes needed to be driven and be barbed into sand in the desert, okay? Which means they needed to go deep. So they were very big. They were not small. And they usually were made of hardwood that would not break, that had a Y. So it had basically a knot in the middle and had two branches coming off of each side. So the rope would not slip up over it, but also that was a very hardened part of that piece of wood. They would sharpen the other end, stick it in the ground. And so what was interesting is they could actually, if they needed to, turn around, pull those stakes up out of the ground, flip them over, and use them for a hedge of protection or defense of the camp from cavalrymen, from horse riders, right? And this is why there's a reference to the tent peg potentially being a weapon, okay? But here's what it actually meant to the Hebrews: secure, established. Now, when you go back and you start thinking about things, for example, a, 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 a vav as a what is it called? What is the particle? What's and in English? A particle. It's not conjunctive. It's something else. I can't remember. Anyways, and it might be a conjunction. I don't know. Anyways,
Said it was a conjunction.
yeah, I think it is a conjunction. But the conjunctive vav in Hebrew is a different grammar thing. The idea of and was the idea of this in addition to this. It was never equal. It was the next extra thing. And a lot of times they were listed in the priority of what was most important to least important to the human's mind. So when they would give a list of the things that they owned, the most important thing would be at the top, right? So we have the idea that it has to do with addition, or it has to do with expansion, or it has to do with abundance, right? So that's one thing. But then the second thing is the concept of establishment, in the sense of making something to go from an insecurity or possibility to something that's established. Let me explain. The vav, when placed beside a imperfect, let me explain imperfect real quick. So in the Hebrew, we do not have past tense and future tense. We have an incomplete action and a completed action. Mm-hmm. So if we say, I will go to such and such place, it's not future tense. They don't speak that way. They don't think that way. The future doesn't exist to a Hebrew. But what that is a promise or commitment. And then what do we have? We have also that the imperative falls into that. So if I say, you will go do this thing, if I'm a superior, that's a command. If I'm an inferior, then that's a request, but it's a request in such a way as it's not given the option to not do it. Okay. So if an inferior ever speaks to a superior in the second person imperative, the superior will have to carry it out, because it's very rare that an inferior will address a superior that way. It's what we call the coercive imperative versus the husive or the jusive imperative, depending on who you ask. Okay, so the reason this is important is because when we're dealing with an incomplete action, okay, there's an insecurity as to whether it will ever happen, because there is no future tense. Okay, you can't create a subjunctive in Hebrew. What's a subjunctive? If I was to say, oh, I wish I was sailing around the world, what is that? Was is what? Past tense in a future state that is a desired state. That's a subjunctive. You can't speak that way in Hebrew. Okay, so in principle, you can't think of the imperative as a future tense. You have to think, I'm sorry, you can't think of the imperfect as a future tense, and you can't think of the perfect as a past tense. It's completed or incomplete action. So the reason this is important is because if I take imperfect and I put a vav next to it, it becomes past tense. It becomes, I'm sorry, not past tense, it becomes completed. So the vav establishes that which is not, right? So now here comes the vav as the personal possessive pronoun of the masculine. Okay. So if something is hers, it'll use a hey. If it's a woman's, if it's a feminine, it will use the hey. But if it's masculine, then it uses the vav. So this is interesting. What's the difference between a woman versus his woman? That she is established in him. So let me tell you what stems from this. You could be like the Levite in the land of Benjamin, who actually has enough compassion for his concubine to put her outside the door because the Benjamites were trying to become sodomites with the Levite. And of course, they do horrible things to her. And in the morning, he does something with her body and ends up starting war. But it's important that you understand that his concubine, or the concubine of him, right, had no value to him. So establishment doesn't necessarily communicate value. It just means that you have received. So we know that the sun, so this is what it says, God causes the sun to shine on the just and the unjust. God causes the sun to shine on the just and the unjust, and the rain to fall on the just and the unjust. Sun, rain, just, unjust, Jacob, ego. In other words, just dwelling in the land as Jacob does not establish him. Okay? But him loving Joseph because he has the attributes of wisdom holds the vision of the covenant. When Yahweh says, I will do this and this and this and this, and Jacob says, if you do this, 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 and this, and I will do this and this, that's covenant. And that's activating the covenant. Abraham never said, I will do this and this and this and this. Isaac never said, I will do this and this and this and this. Jacob says it. And Jacob's the one who has more than one child with the blessing. Meaning what? Meaning that establishing of his mother, his father, his wife doesn't necessarily equate to value, but does equate to a divine connection between him and it. Yeshua says, take no thought for what you will eat, what you will drink, what you will wear. For Solomon, in all of his glory, was not arrayed like a lily of the valley, right? Mm-hmm. If Solomon thought concerning his robes that they were his vav robes, then they were provided to him from divine causing, a causative divine robing, as it were. So what do I mean here? I mean that when a man has property, it is proven that he is provided for. So it doesn't actually say woman, but says, therefore shall a man leave his father who was provided for him and his mother who was provided for him, and shall be joined to his wife who is provided for him. In other words, the Vav establishes that it is more than just a common item. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife. Okay, so then we're talking about a man. Therefore, it would be a Vav. You shall not covet his wife, the wife of him, the established woman of him. Does it mean he values it? No, but it does mean that it was given to him by God. Therefore shall you leave your mother and father and be joined to your wife. No, that's not what it says, does it? It says he shall leave his father. Who's that? The one who Yahweh established as his father, and the one who Yahweh established as his mother. And he shall be joined to the one who Yahweh established as his wife, which is why we can see Bilhah being called a wife and a concubine. And we can see David's concubines being called wives. Because what did the prophecy say? Although I will comment on this also. But the prophecy said, what you did in secret shall be done in front of all Israel, in that your sons will go into your wives. And yet Absalom goes into his concubines. On the other hand, I will say this. I think it's possible that that was a mercy, and that Yahweh preserved the wives of David, including Bathsheba, from Absalom. So I'll lean both ways. And the beauty of it is I can do that. I can get away with that because I'm not a Christian. I'm a Hebrew. I don't have a concrete list of essentials I have to match the Bible interpretation to. Okay, so where does this become relevant? Because now we've got some interesting things going on. The sons of him, the sons of his wives, right? So let's take a look. Let's go jump back into our verse in chapter 37 and see what else we can see. Let me go ahead and pull it up first, and then I will share it with you guys. Okay, yeah. Okay, so took me a minute to find it. Okay, so singular is ish, isha, right? Plural is nashim. Okay. So anashim or anosh, anashim is men and nashim is women. So when we see this nashe right here, nashe, that is actually plural for the word woman. And because the mem is not there, we know it's in a construct state, which means we say of. So let's see. Wives of the established man who was his father. So the established women of his father, or the established women of the man who was established as his father. See how that goes? Okay. So the premise is that this should not be translated as wives of, but instead women of, or established women of, or women established of his father. Okay. That's how we can have Bilhah being called a wife here, and we can have see, that's going to be in verse 35 or chapter 35, verse 22. We can have Bilhah being called a Pilagesh here. Pilagesh here, wife there. That's how she can be called both, because it's the establishing that is important, not the value. Remember, the man who was in Benjamin had the concubine of him, or the concubine who was established for him. Doesn't necessarily mean he values it. Now this makes sense too, because now we can say that this possessive is not ownership, but instead relationship, meaning the animals of him, the sons of him, the wife of him, the servants of him are not possession. It's relationship. So now we can say the God of him, and it not be possessive, but instead be established. What a deep revelation. What a concept that it's not about possession. That's a Western mindset thinking. And it makes sense, because one of the things that I will openly admit, and I'm cautious with this because you guys know that I'm an avid entrepreneur and therefore capitalist. But truth be told, it is very apparent to me that socialism was more the practice of the patriarchs than capitalism was. In other words, the wealth was distributed and shared equally amongst those who were in covenant or who were family with the person who was wealthy. Which I can tell you, I mean, both Deb and I have talked in the past about the practice of equal distribution of wealth. If we ever were wealthy enough to do so, that we would, equally distribute our wealth to our family members, so that they did not have to, that they could experience the financial independence as well, and to friends and things like that. So I think it is a Hebrew lifestyle to share wealth. But this now becomes really important because now we don't have possessions, we have relationships with things.
So
Which explains, right, which explains why Torah says you shall treat your wife as your property. Oh man, our Western civilization mentality and our Western,
how much it's
my
screwed up.
gosh. Man. I mean, can I just say for the record that it seems as though Torah wants us to have a utopia, not a dystopia, like people think? And can I say that people have inappropriately interpreted the Bible and then used it to abuse and to disassociate from and to treat with inequality their wives, their children, and their property? How deep is this? So I don't know if that's the rabbi's nugget today, but that's where my head went during lunch.
Great place to do.
Okay, so we do have a Midrash question that came up during lunch.
Yes,
Okay,
we did.
go ahead.
So I was reading through a little bit further, and this is not a huge revelation as far as I understand it, but I just questioned. Okay, so he's had two dreams, and he's sharing the second dream with his father.
Joseph
Is sharing the second dream with his father. And he says, the sun and the moon and the 11 stars prostrated themselves before me. And his father rebukes him, right? And says, are your mother and I also supposed to prostrate ourselves before you? Okay, that is not really the big question that I have here. The problem that I have with this is, did he interpret it wrong? Because as we know,
did who interpret it wrong?
Did Jacob interpret it wrong? Did Israel interpret it wrong? It says you're his father. It doesn't use Jacob or Israel, as far as I can tell. I went over it a couple of times. Did his father interpret it wrong? Because, as we know, once Jacob comes into Egypt, Joseph's mother is already gone. So the moon never bows to him. So it's either an incorrect interpretation that he and his mother would bow to Joseph, or I'm misunderstanding something. Which I could totally misunderstand something. Now, I will say that I've understood for a very long time that the sun and the moon are representations of man and wife, right?
Okay.
That they are representations of Yeshua and his bride, and the reflection that his bride is supposed to have with him. So I've understood that for a very long time. So I can understand where he would come up with the interpretation of the sun and moon equaling him and his father and mother. I'm just concerned here that it is a wrong interpretation. So,
well, I think we will probably spend the next, I'm going to say, hour discussing this.
might be a big deal.
Okay. So let's start at the beginning. I am going to search for something here. And it's going to require me to use the search function for a minute. but I want to kind of discuss some things concerning Eastern versus Western thought and Eastern versus Western religious practices. I'm trying to think of how else to word this. Okay. When something good happens in Judaism, a marriage, a birth of a child, a bar mitzvah, a graduation, a promotion at work, a wonderful business opportunity, we hear Mazel Tov, right? Mazel Tov. What is actually being spoken here, and why is it being spoken? So there's a couple things that I think are really important. And I think the first one is that we need to accept that there are some differences in belief between Christianity and or what I should call the Roman Western Empire and Judaism that was excluded by the Roman Western Empire. Okay. And the way that I want you to think about that is that in Christianity, or I should say the Western Roman Empire, it is considered witchcraft to practice astrology. And I think it's also important to understand that there are very important things to consider when we talk about this. But there was a verse, and I had to search it out. I will openly admit I had to search for it. I know what it says, but I couldn't remember where it was at. And that is in Job chapter 38, 31 through 33. And we will get to that because I want to make mention of this first and say that when we're working with Job, we have to be very careful of who we think the characters are. But let's just say that we take Christianity's version of who Satan is, Christianity's version of who God is, and Christianity's version of who Job is, and we can conclude that Job 38 starts in this way. Let me show you. Job chapter 38. Then Yahweh answered Job from a whirlwind and said, "Who is this who darkens the divine plan by words without knowledge? Now tighten your belt on your waist like a man, and I shall ask you to, and I inform you, or I'm sorry, and you inform me." So let's just for a minute, I'll keep on the share screen, but I want to say that what's happening here in the Christian sense is God all of a sudden is speaking up after Job has gone on and on about his pain. His friends have gone on and on about his faults, and his friends have gone on and on about his lack of reverence, sanctity, and and righteousness. Job argued that they're wrong, etc., etc. And all of a sudden, now the middle of nowhere, the intensification of all power in the universe speaks up and starts talking to Job. Okay. And he says, man up, suit up, and boot up, because we're about to fight. And while we're fighting, I'll ask you questions and you can answer me. And he even says, who darkens the divine plan? Why are you messing with things this powerful? Well, when we get into it, he starts to get into a discussion down here. In verse 31, it starts, can you tie up the chains of the Pleiades or untie the cords of Orion? Can you bring out a constellation in its season? Or do you guide the bear with her satellites? Do you know the ordinances of the heavens, or do you establish their rule over the earth? How about we jump into a little bit more literal version of that? Dost thou bind sweet influences of Kima, or the attraction of Kessel? Dost thou open? Dost thou bring out the Mazarot in its season? And the Aish in her sons dost thou comfort? Hast thou known the statutes of heaven, or dost thou appoint its dominion on the earth? That word there is basically the Hebrew word, the Mazarot is actually the zodiac. And in the Yiddish, it's Matzal. So when a Jew says Mazel Tov, what he's saying is that the stars were in your favor. Well, that sounds very witchcrafty, doesn't it? I'm going to tell you guys something. You go to a legitimate architecturally built synagogue, not a reform, not a conservative church, right? We know the reformed and conservatives went and basically copied the church. They set up pews, they set up a pulpit, but in the original architecturally Orthodox built synagogues, there is always a round dome with stained glass windows and paintings of what? Do you know? The zodiac. It is a very, very important part of Judaism. And I'm going to tell you, the Mishnah, the Talmud, the rabbis, Rashi, Rambam, Ibn Ezra, Rabbi Akiva, all spoke in some place about the Masirot, the zodiac. So Yahweh's asking Job here in verse 32, can you direct the sequence of seasons in the NLT? But in the Hebrew, can you bring out the zodiac? So why does he ask this? Why does he bring up, can you do this with the stars? Can you do this with the zodiac? Can you do this with Orion and Pleiades? First of all, I think it's very important that you understand that these constellations are anciently recognized in these verses. Job predates Torah. So now what we need to ask is there any representation of the is there any representation of these things in this dream? Sun, moon, and 11 stars, right? So let me explain to you bowing in astrology. When on the elliptical, one constellation is going down below the horizon and the other is above it, this constellation is bowing to this one. Okay. When we then talk about the sun and the moon bowing to a specific constellation, we have some interesting things going on. As the moon moves through the elliptical, it will park itself in the center of a zodiac symbol, and that means that it is in somehow connected in with that zodiac symbol at that time. But as the moon starts to depart away from that zodiac symbol, it is bowing to that zodiac symbol. As it's going down in the sky, as it's changing direction in the sky, there's a bowing occurring, right? Same thing is true of the sun. If the sun is ahead of a zodiac symbol as it crests over noon, starts to head into the afternoon, that zodiac symbol's behind the sun as it's going down, then the sun is bowing to that. I'll give you an example of not really understanding what something means. And you guys know I'm careful to reference the book of Revelation. But there's a part in there where the dragon actually draws a third of the stars of heaven. Well, what's interesting about that is as the constellation starts to arch down into the sky, its head goes below the horizon, but its tail is still out. And as it goes down, all the stars that are contained in that circle go down with it. And it's like 1/3 of the sky. You see, people aren't ready to accept that the book of Revelation is not talking about Satan, the devil. It's talking about recognizing the signs in the heavens, yes, of course, but more importantly, the time period. How did the Magi know that Yeshua had been born? And how did the Magi know to come to Jerusalem? And how did the Magi know that a king was being born? And how did the Magi know that it was going to be the king of the Jews? How did they know all of those things? What were the representations that in the sky that were telling them about the tribes? How come it wasn't the Philistines that the Messiah was going to be born from? You see, when we see references to the zodiac like this, 11 stars bowing to a 12th, that's the zodiac. The sun and the moon, that's the zodiac. Why? Because they travel on the same elliptical in the sky. So the question is, why did Jacob interpret it the way he did? Do you think Jacob was ignorant of astrology? Ignorant of what was happening in the sky? I think not. In fact, it says that Abraham taught Isaac, and Isaac taught Jacob and Esau about the stars. And how much more Jacob when he went and studied under Shem, who is the master of mysticism.
Yeah, you notice that that neither his brothers nor his father needed an interpretation. He just told them the dream and they knew the interpretation.
They got mad.
They got mad at the interpretation of it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So then what we need to ask is there a concept in which one constellation is inferior to another in such a way that would indicate that it is dominant? Absolutely. There's a concept of a constellation being dominant in the sky at a certain period, a certain time period. But then Jacob says, shall I and your mother bow to you?
Mhm.
Now here's the intrigue. If all 11 constellations bow to the 12th constellation and the sun and the moon, then basically we know that those 12 constellations represent the 12 tribes of Israel, which represent the 12 sons that Jacob had. And so when he says, shall I bow, what he's saying is not that he's the son, but shall the entire zodiac bow to you? Right? So then Deb has the question, well, wait a minute. When Jacob finally bows himself to Joseph, and when his brothers bow themselves to Joseph, his mother is not present. What do you think?
Well, in in the in the way that you described the zodiac bowing, or the sun and the moon bowing to the sign that's of that season and stuff, that going down, it made me think, okay, it is going to be like our twilight. We will be in our regression, stage versus being prominent.
Mm. Any thoughts from our people in the Slack audience? Anybody want to unmute and take a stab at this?
One is asking because he knows I'm not right.
Not necessarily. Just want to give everybody a voice. Okay, I've given you guys some time or some opportunity to unmute. So I guess the question is can we identify, how do we identify the people who are in the occupied land in the Middle East? We don't say sons of, we don't use the name Jacob, we don't identify a single tribe. What do we do? What's it called?
It's called Israel.
Why is it called Israel?
That's a good question. Why is it called Israel? Because Israel is supposed to represent all of the tribes of Jacob, not just one tribe.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Which would be the whole zodiac. So the question is there a way in our visible ability? Because you got to remember, if we're sitting here in America observing the zodiac is different than who's sitting in England observing the zodiac, is different from the person who's sitting in the southern hemisphere, like Australia, observing the zodiac, right? So what we need to do is we need to observe from Israel. And observing from Israel, we pretty much have the northern hemisphere zodiac, right? For all intents and purposes. And so, in principle, what we're working with is a concept of each tribe represented by a zodiac symbol.
Mhm.
And we see this over and over actually in the Tanakh. So I like Deb's comment about, hey, there is a possibility of something being in regression and not prominent in astrology, and that being an important interpretation. The question is why would Jacob say, shall I and your mother bow to you?
That's it. That's really the question, to me. Is like, okay, I don't think when Jacob came into Egypt and Joseph is, and this is next week's kind of portion, but um uh Jacob didn't necessarily bow to him. And certainly not his mother. His mother is gone by that point. Um so I I just am like, okay, did he misunderstand that this would be a sign of Joseph's time, that they would be in regression? His mother would definitely have been in regression. That I can see that now, but did he misinterpret it as bowing versus a regression and Joseph being in a prominent position?
You guys know what tribe is represented by Joseph? Anybody know?
It's not Gemini, is it?
No, what tribe?
Oh. Oh, the tribe. Isn't it Manasseh?
It's not Manasseh. Manasseh was the firstborn, yes. But Joseph is represented by Ephraim.
Ephraim.
Who is what? Who's going to be the fullness of the Gentiles,
Yes.
right?
Mhm.
Okay. So this is very important because Ephraim is represented by Libra. Okay. And so one of the things that's interesting about it is when we go through and identify the tribes, we don't see Joseph in the zodiac. Okay.
Mhm.
But the other,
Together, his sons represent all of what are commonly called the Gentiles, right? The nations.
Mhm. Okay. So it's interesting because in a weird sort of way, we almost have a concept that Joseph's line continues through Ephraim, not Manasseh. Because and the reason I bring this up is because if I go over to the book of Revelation, we get a very interesting thing happening concerning the tribes. Some people may say that this is perhaps an error on the part of the Greek when it was translated from Aramaic, which was translated from Hebrew. But we have basically the tribe of Judah, Reuben, Gad, Asher, Naphtali, Manasseh, Simeon, Levi, Issachar, Zebulon, Joseph, and Benjamin. So something interesting has happened by the time of the book of Revelation, and that is there is no tribe of Ephraim, anywhere in there. And there's no tribe of Dan anywhere in there. Now, there's something intriguing about this because when you go to a site, a website of some sort, and look at the traditional zodiac association with the tribes, we have Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, Reuben, Simeon, Gad, Ephraim, Manasseh, Benjamin, Dan, Asher, and Naphtali. There is no Levi, and there is no Joseph. So there's a few ways that we could go about thinking about this. One is that Levi did not get an inheritance, right? But the problem is, in the book of Revelation, Levi is present. Dan is not. Now, according to most theologians, the reason Dan is not present is because he betrays his brothers in the book of Revelation. He is the tribe who causes all the ruckus in the first place. Most theologians will associate Libra with Levi. Okay, most will, and so I think we have to be cautious, right? But I can tell you that I am given the impression that this is a zodiac reference. I'm given the impression that Jacob interpreted it as if basically Joseph was saying that he would supersede the zodiac. And Jacob was like, how's that possible? Right? Abraham teaches the zodiac to Isaac, and nobody knows about the tribes of Israel yet. Isaac teaches it to his sons, and nobody knows about the tribes of Israel yet. It's not until the tribes of Israel are born that they are associated with those zodiac symbols, and it was according to when they were born. Supposedly they were born during each solar prominence. So there's a couple ways that we could look at this, because the book of Revelation clearly references astrology. I am cautious that I will remind you that there is actually a Jewish saying, which is, how's it go? Yeah. Ein Mazal Israel. Ein Mazal Israel means the zodiac will never supersede Israel, right? Or the zodiac is absent of Israel. Ein means not present. Ein means does not exist. And so I wonder if the concept is that Joseph was going to supersede the zodiac in his ability. Now, it's interesting because there is a Kabbalistic concept that the zodiac is just another concealment, that the zodiac is for those who have not yet mastered mysticism in such a way that they don't need to look at the sky to see what's going to happen. Now, I can tell you, the Magi determined that a Messiah was going to be born in the nation of Israel, and so they came to Jerusalem to worship him. They knew that they would need to worship him. That's another very weird question. Why do these Eastern mystics want to come worship a Jewish Messiah? Right? Lots of questions, not a lot of answers. But the point is that we have to be cautious not to misinterpret this, because we have what? We have a woman clothed with the sun with 12 stars above her head and the moon at her feet. and a dragon seeking to devour her, which consequently happens when Virgo is in prominence. Draco is pursuing her in the sky. I think it's Draco, might be Hydra, is pursuing her in the sky. Okay. And we could get into all kinds of stuff here, couldn't we? But the bottom line is that if we have a reference to the sky, we need to pay attention to the sky and the information. And so that is where I'm at with it in that thought process, which explains why he could say that about his mother, per se. So did Jacob interpret it wrong? Nope, I don't think that's possible. I don't think that's possible. I don't think Jacob would just flat. I mean, even his brothers were angry with him. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't make any sense. Now we know the sheaves were his brothers coming and getting food from him, right? And we know that that concept happened, but what we don't realize, a lot of people don't, is who the Messiah will be. The son of Joseph. Messiah ben Joseph, son of Joseph. Mm-hmm. Son of meaning that which is similar or emulates yourself, continuing the legacy. So when they say Messiah ben Joseph, there's a whole study on Messiah ben Joseph that he would be a humble, passive one who suffered people to be disrespectful to him or abusive to him and not react, as opposed to David, who will cut your head off, right? So there's a lot to be said there. But what's interesting is this brings us into a concept that is totally foreign to Christianity, and that is we are supposed to be watching the sky and understanding what it is saying. Are we supposed to interpret omens? Are we supposed to expect that the stars are going to actually influence our life? No, that's all hogwash. Because why? Ein Mazal Yisrael. There is no zodiac for Israel. Meaning what? The stars do not influence us. Do you know why? One of the biggest reasons why, according to Talmud, we cover our heads is because the pagans would uncover the heads so that the stars would influence them. And they believed if they covered their heads, they could not have that influence. So the rabbis were like, well, we don't want that influence. We want the influence of God. We'll cover our heads. There's more, right? Because in Leviticus, when a man becomes leprous, he is to uncover his head, meaning what? The norm was for them to cover their heads. Now, from a practical perspective, you cover yourself in the desert to protect yourself from the sun, from the wind. But from a spiritual perspective, we cover our heads because we don't want the influence of the stars. We want the influence of God. From a mental perspective, we cover our heads to show that we are under somebody's covering. We are under somebody's authority, right? From an emotional perspective, we cover our heads to respect and honor the Torah that by default expects you to cover your head. Doesn't say why. It just says, if he's sick, he uncovers his head. Meaning what? You should have your head covered. Oh, but Paul says you have to remove your hat when you're praying. Remove your hat when you enter a building. Yeah. I'm going to tell you right now, that's all hogwash. It's a misinterpretation of those Greek words. And what's more, and what's most inappropriate about it, is it's a reference to a man donning a veil like a woman, because the Corinthians were gender fluid. And so Torah is saying, no, you need to maintain your gender. You need to operate within the principle in which you were born, because that's part of your purpose. When man and woman are in operation of how they were born, they are in operation of the natural order processes of the mystical existence of the feminine and masculine principles of God and their purposes. Women are extremely powerful in what they are as a feminine principle of God. And unfortunately, instead, we've decided as civilizations to misogynize women, to treat them in a wrong manner because of a belief that they're inferior, when actually they are superior. Okay, so what is the relevance of the fact that Jacob bowed to his son, the 11 children bowed to Joseph, but Rachel did not?
Yeah, considering that throughout scripture, we hear scripture like the fullness of the Gentiles, which always has led me to think of the fullness of the moon, things along those lines. And then we don't see a Manasseh in Revelations, or we don't see an Ephraim in Revelations. That brings up some questions, doesn't it?
I have a question, and this is a difficult one, but I think I want to actually take a break a little early and come back and do session 3 and ask this question. So instead of us, we normally would have another like 15 minutes before we knock off, according to when we started this session. But I want to wait. I want to save this question until the 3rd session. So why don't we take a break now? We'll come back in about 30 to 45 minutes and we'll start again. And I will ask my question. Okay. For those of you who are not able to stay, I'll say Shabbat Shalom. For those of you who will be back with us in the 3rd session, I look forward to it. And